It's that time of year when harvesting and preserving is at its peak. We finally have lots of tomatoes. The pears, apples, winter squash, and pumpkins are ready. I'll show you what I'm harvesting, how I preserve it, and how we make the best apple cider. This has been one of the hottest summers we've had in quite a while, and because of that, our tomatoes didn't produce so well over the summer months. But once the temperatures dropped just a little bit, we finally have some production that's coming on, and I got a lot of tomatoes that I need to harvest this week. Even though I got a fairly good harvest early on with my heirloom tomatoes, as the summer went, they didn't look so good and the production wasn't there. They had no new starts on them and no flowers. So I went ahead and pulled all of those heirloom tomatoes out so that I could get a fall crop in their place. And then the rest of the tomatoes that had small tomatoes or even tomatoes that are getting close to ripening, I went ahead and cut those back about 3 weeks ago. What that does is that pushes energy down into the plant and those tomatoes and helps them ripen before we have a first frost. To give you an idea of what last year was like compared to this year, last year I bottled almost 300 quarts of tomatoes, and this year, so far, I've only done 25 quarts. I grow a lot of basic red tomatoes for bottling as well as a lot of San Marzanos. Celebrity, Better Bush, and Early Girl always perform well for us here in the heat, so I like to plant about 40 to 50 plants of these, just a mix. That way I make sure that I have plenty for bottling. I actually prefer the taste and the texture of a lot of those heirloom tomatoes, but I plant a lot of these basic reds because they do perform well every year and they're a great backup plan when the heirlooms don't. The basic red round tomatoes are definitely more watery than your paste type tomatoes of San Marzano and Romas. They're great for making sauce, whereas your paste type tomatoes obviously are good for making paste. Paste type tomatoes have thicker walls, fewer seeds, and they're less watery, and they don't make the best slicers. I prefer to grow the San Marzano paste tomatoes over the Roma paste tomatoes for a couple of reasons. One, no matter what I do, Roma tomatoes always end up with blossom end rot, and that's a lot to do with our climate. And the other reason is San Marzanos have done so well for me, I don't end up with blossom end rot, and they continue to produce through the season until we have our first frost because they're an indeterminate type tomato. And I personally prefer the flavor and the texture of San Marzano tomatoes. When I make my tomato sauce, I like to combine the regular red round slicers as well as some type of a paste tomato. That thickens that sauce and it gives it a really good, full, rich flavor. I can process a lot of tomatoes really fast with a tomato sauce maker. I have two. One is electric and it's from VEVOR, and it can process a lot of tomatoes really quick without much effort. The other is a hand crank, and the downside to that is it's just a little bit more labor intensive, but when you're cranking the handle you got to pay pretty close attention to it or that handle pops off. But the plus side to that is if I ever had a power outage, I could still use my sauce maker. All I have to do to make a nice sauce is core and quarter the tomatoes, and it separates the seeds and the skin from the juice and the flesh. I can just use that sauce just as it is and preserve it, or I can cook it down to make it thicker. If you don't cook it down or reduce that sauce, then you'll have a thinner sauce, as well as after you process it, you'll see that there'll be some water that settles on the top. This is one of the fastest ways that you can make tomato sauce, and I really like it when I'm in a hurry. And it's excellent when used for cooking chili. Those beans just absorb all of that extra moisture, giving it an extra rich flavor. When I have extra time, I'll definitely cook it down to make that sauce much thicker. That saves me some time in the long run for other dishes. One of my favorite ways to preserve tomatoes, and the most versatile, is to make a garlic herb tomato sauce, and I'll share that recipe with you. After saucing the tomatoes, I start to cook them down or reduce the sauce, and for every 10 pounds of tomatoes, I'll add 6 large cloves of crushed garlic, 2 teaspoons of fresh oregano, 2 teaspoons of fresh rosemary, 2 teaspoons of fresh thyme, 2 teaspoons of salt, and 2/3 cup of apple cider vinegar. Cook this over a medium heat for about 45 minutes or until the sauce is reduced to the thickness that you want. It usually takes about 30 to 45 minutes. Make sure that you stir often so that you don't burn the bottom. Once it's reduced, then I'll add about 4 tablespoons of fresh basil and ladle the hot sauce in warm pint jars and process in a water bath canner for about 30 minutes. You might have to adjust your canning time for your elevation. And if you don't know what that is, then I'll put a link in the description to help you figure that out. But most canning books will cover that issue as well. This sauce is an excellent sauce to be added for bases for pasta sauces, pizza sauces, or anything that calls for tomato sauce. With the pulp that the sauce maker separates the seeds and the skins, I actually save that and I freeze dry it. I'll put a nice thin layer on my freeze dryers and dry it. And then once it's dry, I powder. You can also use a regular dryer for this. Just make sure, whichever way you're using it, that it's completely dry. Once it's completely dry, put it in an airtight jar. This powder is an excellent substitute for tomato paste, but it's also really good to thicken soups, stews, and anything that you would use tomato paste in. I love putting this powder in my sandwich bread recipes. I use 4 tablespoons for every 2 loaves that I make. It gives it an excellent flavor, a color, and added nutrition. When my bread is rising, I also like to use this powder to sprinkle over the top of the bread before it's been cooked. That adds that really sweet caramelized flavor. This is the perfect way to use up what might be considered waste and get more out of your garden. If you don't plan on making powder with the waste, then at least toss it into your compost pile or feed it to your chickens. But don't give your chickens too much. Feed it to them as a treat rather than their daily ration. Otherwise, they can get an upset digestive system. We would like to thank VEVOR for sponsoring this video. If you're wanting to speed up your tomato sauce processing time, VEVOR's tomato sauce maker makes tomato sauce making a breeze, separating the skin and the seeds from the flesh, making a smooth, delicious tomato sauce with ease. When it's time to clean your machine, just disassemble, wash in soapy water, clean the screen with a soft brush, and store dry. I'll put a link in the description if you want to check it out, along with a coupon code to get 5% when you use the code. Every little bit helps these days. This year our apples have been very bountiful, and one of our family's favorite things to do with our apples is to make apple cider. Last year we didn't get very many apples, and that seems to be how it is for us here. Every other year is extremely productive, and we always have an off year where we don't get so many. We have Liberty, Fuji, Gala, and Scarlet. These are all really good, fresh-eating apples that are really nice and crisp and juicy. We also have Granny Smith and Winesap. These are excellent for cooking. They hold up to cooking without getting mushy. We also get quite a few apples from my brother's place. They're an old variety and we don't know what they are, but they make a great addition to our apple cider. You can make apple cider with just about any type of apples, but it's better if you use the juicier, crisper type rather than the cooking type. But I do like to add a little bit of the cooking type of apples like Winesap to add that spicy taste to the apple cider. You can also make your apple cider with just one variety, but I will tell you, you will get a much better tasting, more rich, more complex flavor with a mix of different varieties of apples. For our apple cider, I'll mix our Fujis, our Galas, Liberties, Scarlets, a little bit of Winesap, and all of my brothers that we get. And this creates a really yummy tasting apple cider. I also really love to add some ripe pears to the mix, usually about 10% or less, and this really adds to that richness of the flavor. Oh, it's so good. Making apple cider has become one of our family's fall traditions that we do every year. We can crank out a lot of apples in a small amount of time, and it's a good family get-together. We can usually do 12 bushels of apples in about 2 hours. We usually have dinner out by the fire pit, have fresh pressed apple cider, and enjoy the beginning of fall. The apples get a good rinse. We don't use any harmful pesticides, so I never have to scrub them. We just rinse them off, then quarter them, or smaller for bigger apples, removing any bad spots, then run them through the apple crusher, seeds, core, skin, and all. Using the crusher makes it easier to press out the juice, and it gives you a much higher juice yield. Our grandkids are really starting to like this job. Then the crushed apples go into the press and it gets cranked down. This is when my grandkids come to see if the cider passes the test, and I think it does. What do you think?
It's so good. It's so much worth the work.
I got the best grandkids, and they're such good help too. By pressing apples rather than running them through a juicer, you get a richer, more complex taste. Juicing is generally more clear and refined. If you've never had fresh pressed apple cider, you have to try it. Once we have the apples pressed, we put a large portion into jugs to be frozen over the winter months, and it freezes nicely. We don't fill up the jugs all the way, allowing for enough room for expansion when it freezes. And of course, we leave some out for fresh sipping. I also freeze dry a lot of our apples in pears. I just simply core them and then run them through our food processor that dices them. Then I'll spread them out over the freeze dryer trays, sprinkle it with some cinnamon and some nutmeg. These are great for going on hikes or even trail rides. Our winter squash and pumpkins are on, and one of my favorite ways to store them in the fall time is by decorating. A couple things that I need to watch for when I'm decorating with those pumpkins outside is our heat in southern Utah. We're still in 100 degrees, and if I were to put them out in full sun after they've been harvested, this can cause them to sun scald, and then they don't keep. So I need to make sure that they're in the shade, especially in the hottest part of the day. The other thing that I have to watch for is once we start to freeze. Those low temperatures can also damage those winter squash and pumpkins. If they're under a covered porch, they're pretty safe. But once we consistently go down into 25 degrees, I need to make sure that I move those into storage so that I can have them for use for the winter time. I freeze a bunch of my winter squash and pumpkins for winter use that's easy to use. I cut and clean out the seeds of the pumpkin, then bake it at 350 degrees, covered or upside down till soft. Every pumpkin will be different on the time that it takes for it to cook. Then scoop out the meat and run it through a food processor until it has a smooth texture, and then I'll pour it into quart-sized freezer bags. I'll put in 15 ounces of puree in each bag. That's what most recipes call for. It stores flat and doesn't take up a ton of room. I really love pie pumpkins, but I think that the heirloom pumpkins and winter squash actually have a smoother texture and taste for cooking. Cinderella pumpkins are sweet and mild. Girardelle are sweet with a smooth, velvety texture. Both of these are great for making pies, cookies, breads, whatever pumpkin. Pumpkins and winter squash can take up a lot of room in your garden, and I like to save that room for other vegetables. So I like to grow some of my winter squash and pumpkins around the base of my fruit trees out in my orchard. There's several winter squashes that can be used as a replacement for pumpkin, and some of those that work really good are butternut, blue Hubbard, and kabocha. Really, most of these winter squashes and pumpkins can be used interchangeably. They each have their own textures and flavors. A lot of times I'll do a mix of different pumpkins and winter squash when I'm preserving. With the pumpkins and winter squash that I freeze, I'll use those in soups, risottos, curries, pasta sauces, breads, and cookies. Really, it's pretty versatile. With some of the smaller, thinner skinned squashes, the winter squashes, like this acorn, which is a mashed potato acorn squash, and the delicata, you can actually eat the flesh and the skin as well. And you're getting far more nutrients than you would without eating it. Simply slice them, clean out the seeds, sprinkle with salt, pepper, olive oil, and you can even add a touch of sweet by drizzling over some honey or maple syrup, and then roast it at 400 degrees till soft. Simple and very easy and satisfying. We grow our own organically, but if I were to buy it from the grocery store, I definitely want to buy organic. Squash that's grown conventionally has had pesticides used on it, and we try to avoid that at all costs. And that pesticide can be absorbed into that skin, and that's something we don't want to use. When it comes to storing produce like our apples, onions, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and even some of our winter squash, I really like these collapsible crates. The good thing about them is when you're not using them, they collapse flat and they store a lot easier. They're great because they have a lot of airflow. They're extremely sturdy. I can stack 4 or 5 of these crates, giving me more space vertically, and that's really good because we have small space for our storage here. These shorter crates are excellent for storing things like your potatoes and your onions. That way you can keep an eye on those to make sure that you don't have any bad at first glance when you're looking at them, and they're still stackable. I like these deeper crates for storing things like winter squash because they can be piled on top of each other and it doesn't hurt them because they don't bruise, and because they're bigger, it can accommodate more squash. I also like them for things like apples. Something that I'm going to be using up rather quickly. I'll probably be preserving these either into an apple pie filling or an applesauce, so they won't stay in here for very long. It's October and we're coming down to the end of our fruit season in our orchard. We still have 2 peach trees. They're Fairtime peaches that I'll be harvesting in the next week or 2. They're Fairtime peaches and they generally come on the first or second week in October. Fairtime peaches are really nice because it kind of gives you that last hurrah or that last chance if you didn't bottle up enough peaches. Fairtime peaches are kind of firm, but they're still really nice and juicy. These peaches are excellent for eating fresh, and what we don't eat fresh, I'll split it and I'll do half with the bottling of them and the other half I'll freeze dry. This gives me a big diversity of different ways of storage, and that's really a good idea just in case something goes bad. We have 3 pomegranate trees nestled right behind the chicken coop. This helps shade them during the hot summer months. The 3 varieties that I have are Ambrosia, Dixie Sweet, and Wonderful. Wonderful is really nice for juicing, and what I like to do with that is just slice them right in half and then just squeeze out the juice, and then I freeze that for winter use. You can mix it with lemonade or blueberry lemonade. It all makes it really good. They're not quite ready yet, even though I could start eating them now. They'll be a little bit sweeter if we have a little bit cooler temperatures and we're more into mid part of October. Pears are one of my favorite fall fruits and I love to bottle them. And to add just a little bit extra flavor, I'll take 1 piece of ginger, a slice of it, and 1 star anise, and I'll nestle those both in the bottle of the jar. And then I'll just process my pears as usual, and the flavor is absolutely wonderful. A favorite fall dish of ours is pear salad. All you're doing is slicing the pears, putting it right over the top of freshly cut arugula, and then you just use some toasted almonds or even pecans. Add some feta cheese. Kevin likes blue cheese, drizzle with some balsamic vinegar and some olive oil, and a couple grinds of fresh pepper. To me, pears are the epitome of fall, and I think fall produce is the best. Poached pears are excellent, and pear butter is pretty similar to apple butter, and you would basically use it the same way. It just has a little bit of different texture and flavor, and it's excellent on bagels for breakfast. Pear crisp is an excellent dessert, and you can use fresh pears or even your bottled pears for this. Peppers come on pretty heavy in the fall here in my zone 8. I'll go ahead and fire roast all of my Hives and anchos. Then I'll freeze these. I can use them during the winter time for chili rellenos and throw those into chili as well. I'll also take the jalapenos and I'll make pickled jalapenos and store those in the refrigerator. These are excellent condiments to have on hand. The largest portion of my peppers I'll freeze dry. I'll run these through my dicing food processor. This makes the job really quick when you have a lot of peppers to process. I'll lay them out on the freeze dryer tray, chopped, and this will be just a big mix of them. Then I'll freeze dry them. Those will be stored in jars for later use for chilies or wherever you'd use peppers. But you can also powder these, and it makes an excellent chili powder. The nice thing about making your own chili powder this way is with all those different varieties of peppers, it gives you a rich, smoky flavor that you'd never find in the grocery store. But the big benefit is it doesn't have any preservatives or any anti-caking agents, so it's definitely better for you. Preserving certainly takes time and effort, but the end product is definitely more healthy. And it's very rewarding. But the big thing is, you can pronounce every single ingredient that goes into it. Happy harvest, and may God bless you with a bountiful harvest this fall.